I'd like to share my favorite new tool. It's a miter vise. That I purchased mostly to cut tubing with. It has many uses, but what I use it mostly for is to cut tubing accurately for putting tube rivets inside of beads, for really short tube rivets for lining the hole and with a nice finish for the jump ring, for cutting tubing for tube setting stones, for cutting short pieces of heavy gauge wire accurately. So mostly, since I do a lining glass beads, I'm going to show cutting for that. I have a lampwork glass bead and that I made, and I'm going to line it with tight, relatively tight fitting thin wall fine silver tubing, cut accurately. And to do that, I'm putting first a little silver washer, and then the bead, and then another silver washer. The silver washers are really just jump rings that have been soldered closed. The purpose being to have a finish to push the tubing over. Okay, so I like to use my miter vise in the vise, which is not clamped down, it's just free. And then insert the tubing and determine the correct length of the tube, which is going to be whatever I like to have on one end plus the other end. Tighten it down. Oops. Looks like a little bit much. I'll lose a little bit with the sawing, but not much. It's a fine blade. So take the bits off and put them in something so I don't lose them. And now I'm going to use a short throat saw frame with a 6/0 blade, because this is 30 gauge fine silver, and it's the gauge of the silver that determines the blade. And how this is going to work is I'll hold the frame vertically, push it up against the face of the vise, hold the vise with one hand and saw That's the piece I'm going to use, but before I remove this other end, I'm going to clean the cut up so it'll be ready for the next time. If it wasn't accurately cut, which hasn't been a problem, and I needed to remove some material, I would use a flat file, an old one, because I don't want to damage a file with this hard steel, and I could sand up file up against it like that with no harm. But for really finishing the ends, I'm using a flexible sanding board. This is important when you do a rivet that there's no nicks in the silver, that it's very polished. Otherwise, setting the rivet can split the metal. So that's the end of it clean. And then just a little burr on the inside is removed with tapered burr like that. And then I'll move it out a bit and clean up the end even more. Could polish it quite a bit this way. And that one's ready. And this one already had one end clean, but the end I just cut, I'm going to put it in, sand it, clean out the burr from the inside. Polish the outside edge. And now, let's see how I did, which I'll put the ends on. It's a little more, when it's a long rivet like this inside a bead, you give a little extra length, so when it flares, it'll compress a little bit inside. So I'm leaving a little bit on each extra on each end that I wouldn't do if it was a very short rivet. So I'm not demonstrating riveting at the moment. This was just how to use the tool. Other good uses are that I'm going to cut a very small bail, which I could make out of a jump ring, but this way I can cut extremely accurate, very short pieces of tubing, so there's no seam. And then that could be soldered on a piece as the bail. What else? If I'm trying to finish two ends of the ring so that when they come around, they line up really perfectly, this is a 90-degree cut. I probably cut with the saw on the pin, but then I put it back in here and sand and polish it until it was perfect. Give it a tiny bevel, and then when I bring it around, it'll close up perfectly. I also make linings for larger holes in glass beads, and it's very similar, except for there didn't need a washer, and this is the tube cutting jig that would normally have been used in the past, or I had normally used in the past. Had a lot of frustrations with accuracy and limitations it has anyway, so I no longer use that. had a hard time finding it. I use this much more than I expected to when I bought it. I'm really happy that I finally did. I thought it was pricey, but now I don't think so. So, highly recommended.